where there was a character that constantly deemed things inappropriate. So I just wanted to say, if you're interested in 20-plus-year-old pop culture references, then you have come to the right place. Otherwise, if you are interested in talking about what's appropriate technology use in schools, we'll be covering that as well. So just to kind of explain where I'm coming from with this, I'm going to try and be very descriptive as opposed to prescriptive. I don't want to say that something is definitely inappropriate, but rather take the point of view that, you know, most of this technology that we're going to talk about, they're tools. And there is a right way to use a tool and a wrong way. And so trying to talk about in this presentation, I'm going to go over maybe questions that should be asked, things that should be thought about, steps that should be taken for most technologies. Just the same as, you know, using scissors to cut your grass. That should beg some questions before we do that. But that's the approach I'd like to take today. So with that in mind, when I say inappropriate, one of the things that comes to my mind first is, well, what is appropriate? So I came up with 6 things, and only one of them has to do with actually complying with the law, which I know is what Future Privacy Forum often is very much their focus. But to be completely honest, a lot of this new technology and new initiatives appearing in schools, there's not a lot of legal theory around. So it is worth thinking about some other things as well whenever you're going to start implementing something new. So I'm going to talk about 6 in this presentation. The first one will be legal compliance, then steps that can be taken to avoid harm, cost-benefit analysis, parent input, the intended use of the technology, and then its effectiveness or its pedagogical value. I think these are all things that are appropriate for technology to do. And so these are 6 things that I came up with, probably not an exhaustive list of everything that comes to mind with appropriate, but these are the ones I want to focus on. So first, legal compliance. So it's worth saying up front that FERPA especially, but a lot of these privacy laws follow a reasonableness standard. So what that means is, and I don't know if anyone has seen PTAC, they do their FERPA 101 presentation. One of the slides they do, it shows a picture of a schoolhouse and a picture of the Pentagon. And this is where they mention this idea of reasonableness, that, you know, what might be good for the Pentagon is probably unreasonable for a schoolhouse. So it's worth asking ourselves with following the law, are we being reasonable? If you have teachers that are complaining, or it feels like you're being punitive when it comes to protecting student data, then chances are you need to ask yourself, is this reasonable? Do we need to go this far? Just as some examples of things I thought of that sounded reasonable, that if teachers are going to be signing kids up for websites and apps, that they should tell somebody what they're using in the classroom. They should tell the school administration. They should tell parents. That doesn't feel unreasonable to me. Going to a back to school night and getting a list of, here's all the websites we'll be using in the class so that you know about it. I don't think it's unreasonable that when you are done using an app or website, to contact them and say, hey, we're not using this anymore. Can you please delete all the data that you have on the students we shared? Sometimes that might even, be built into the system where it's like, I am ending my time with you, so please delete everything. I don't think it's unreasonable to ensure that parents aren't being denied their basic FERPA rights, such as having access to student records. So if a website you're signing kids up for does not allow you to see what they're doing or what records they might be creating, then that might also be something of a red flag. And I don't think it's unreasonable to get input from teachers, from parents, from other stakeholders whenever you're starting some kind of new technology initiative. Again, this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but just things that felt reasonable to me. And I think it's also worth saying that, what might be reasonable in a major urban area might not be reasonable in a smaller rural district or at a charter school. You have to, look at overall, like what you're capable of handling as a part of what is reasonable. One thing that has come up that I've tried to talk about a lot with schools in Utah that I feel like has been a bit of an overreaction is we have some schools that say like, teachers, if you're emailing parents, you can't use the student's name in the email because you got to protect that student's privacy. And this feels very strange to me. And I've heard teachers complain, I've heard parents complain where it's like, they won't even like say my kid's name. They use like only the initials or the student number or something like that. And the justification, I think, for this is a little unreasonable. First of all, one, parents have a right to access their child's student records. They know their kid's name. And while it is true that a student's name would be considered PII, so would the parent's name. So would the parent's email address, right? It's directly identifiable to the student. So really, I would argue that it's impossible to email a parent without disclosing some kind of PII. So really, what I generally counsel when schools say like, oh, we were thinking of doing this, it's like, well, think of the risks and benefits, Is sending a student's name over email terribly risky? I think we've just kind of accepted as a society that it's, we send each other our names over email. That's not, I think, that large of a deal, even if it's coming off a student record. Even I think of in identifying phishing emails, that's one of generally considered a best practice is like if you get an email and it's a phishing email, it probably isn't going to address you personally. It will just say things like you or customer. Whereas if they call you by your name, that's generally something the company will do. It's just one little thing that is considered, something you should look for in the case of trying to decide if there's red flags in a phishing email. So I just find it interesting where as kind of a best practice, you should be saying people's names. So honestly, I don't want to say one thing right or the other. It just seems strange to me, maybe a little bit too prescriptive to say like you can't use students' names in an email, particularly if you're emailing parents. So I think that's one where I've said like, well, if you feel like it's reasonable, go ahead, but it isn't really required by the law. Another one to talk about in terms of reasonableness is CIPA. So you might be familiar with the Children's Internet Privacy Act, which requires you to have certain internet safety policies. And this is a list of what all of them are. And I want to focus on this last one on my little list, which includes monitoring of online activities of minors. And CIPA doesn't really give a lot of detail into what that monitoring should look like. Is that just, simply looking over a student's shoulder every now and then during the computer lab? Does it mean installing software that tracks every single thing they do? It can be hard to answer what is a reasonable amount of monitoring. But again, I think this is where it can be helpful is looking at your school community and saying, well, what makes the most sense for our population, for the students we are trying to protect? And then I also want to give an example of where they definitely went too far. This was a couple years ago in the Lower Marion School District outside of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, which has come to be known as Webcam Gate. Long story short, the school had webcams and all the devices that the students took home, and they activated them while the students were in their bedrooms. The justification they gave for this was that, well, we need to be able to track lost and stolen devices. One would question if turning webcams on in students' bedrooms was a reasonable way to do that. It seems like there were probably simpler ways to accomplish the same thing without violating students' privacy so much. The end of the story is that the school district settled outside of court and cost a decent amount of money to them for something that was probably unreasonable in the first place, that they shouldn't have been doing. Okay, moving on to the second topic then, avoiding harm. And This again is outside of legal compliance. There's nothing in the law that says you can't harm students necessarily. Maybe certain harms you shouldn't be doing. But I feel like a lot of the law, particularly privacy law, when it comes to students, is built on this idea of avoiding harm, right? CIPA exists because we have decided that it is harmful for children under the age of 13 to see certain types of advertising, to have information taken from them. They don't understand what they are doing when they're on the internet. They don't understand all of the ramifications. That's why this law exists. It's basically this idea that we don't want to harm this very young, vulnerable population. So I think this is worth asking with any new technology, even if legally we haven't decided that it shouldn't be allowed. So let's talk about algorithms, for example, which can have some harmful repercussions depending on the decisions that they make. So if you're going to start using any kind of algorithmic decision-making, whether it's fully automated, whether it's partially automated, it's worth asking yourself, are we being transparent about this process? Transparency helps lead to accountability. And with algorithms, the transparency becomes tricky because it can be very difficult to understand what the algorithm is doing. So honestly, if you're going to do transparency for algorithms, it's very good to focus on the process, not the specific math. So that is to say, what inputs will be put into the algorithm? If you get a certain output, what are you going to do with it? Making it clear what the process is going to be, even if you can't necessarily always explain the math behind it. I think it's also very important to think about how high stakes the results of the algorithm are. Example I like to give is, if the Netflix algorithm makes a bad recommendation to me, it just ruins my Friday night. If your school invests in an algorithm that helps determine student placement, it can have a very serious impact on that student, particularly if it's a false negative. So when you have high stakes, you do need to think about those processes where it's like, well, do we have a way to be able to contest decisions that are made from it? To be able to monitor the fairness of the algorithm, to make sure it is doing things the way we want it to do. So that's if you're doing something to help you make decisions. Algorithms, though, are almost inescapable in our daily lives, largely because of how we interact with the internet. And I'm just going to give this as an example, and I think it's worth pointing out. I'm not really sure what to do about it. But a decently well-known story is when Ferguson was happening and there were riots. If you went to Twitter, Twitter at the time would display its content basically in order that it was entered. So as it allowed for a large event like this in the United States to just kind of explode for everyone to see it there. Meanwhile, if you had gone to Facebook, which at the time was completely algorithmically filtered, all you would have seen was people dropping buckets of water on themselves because Ferguson did not meet the algorithm's threshold for something to start appearing in people's news feeds. This is a similar issue, with Google searches. I think we've started treating Google essentially like it's the new form of a library. We tell our students, go Google it. That's where you'll find the information. When in reality, Google is somewhat limited. It isn't always good for finding any information. It's very good, I think, for finding advertisements, which, Google is an advertising company. That's how they make most of their revenue. So again, it's the kind of thing where I feel like it's unavoidable. We can't just stop using search engine kind of technology, but it's worth, I think, bringing up to students and letting them know the limitations. Or just another example that I find very interesting, speaking of Google and their subsidiary YouTube, there was a study last year. What do YouTube videos say about public education? And the YouTube algorithm, if you just put in public education, the majority of the videos that would come back were overwhelmingly negative about public education. And I find this very fascinating. If I were a teacher and had my students and I wanted them to do an assignment on understanding public education better, if they had gone to this forum, they would not be receiving unbiased information. The information they would receive was going to be, for the most part, very one-sided. And is that good for education? Is that what we want? I think also a harm to think about is what I'm going to call teaching to the tech. This is, I think most of us are familiar with the idea of teaching to the test. When we have high stakes tests, then the teachers are going to be incentivized to teach to ensure that students get good test scores, not necessarily that they learn things. Technology can have a similar effect. Our technology is generally going to measure things that are easily quantifiable, easily measurable. Other aspects of a child's education that you can't really turn into a number, you might completely avoid mentioning. And I think, if you start putting certain technology in the classroom, that is going to dictate how you teach. It's going to incentivize you to do things so that that technology is giving you the numbers that you want, whether or not the kid actually learns anything from it. This was a study that came out, looks like about 2 years ago. Code Red, The Danger of Data-Driven Instruction. So this was a group out of NYU that was looking particularly at low-income students in New York City. And they did a bunch of case studies in the area. And I think, their ultimate result was very fascinating, which was that data-driven instruction can distort the way reading is taught, harming the students who need high-quality instruction the most. Because everything became so focused basically on the data and less on the actual students. What they ultimately recommend in this study, that we should be data-informed. Data should be one point among many that helps us make decisions about what to do. But if we're completely data-driven, then we're going to unintentionally, I think, only care about what the data say and not necessarily whether students are learning things. Okay, cost-benefit analysis, because as we all know, technology can cost some money sometimes. Joke I like to give at this point is, well, students would probably learn really well if we had a 1-to-1 particle accelerator ratio, but in a cost-benefit analysis, that's simply just not going to be there. It's going to be too expensive. I also want to say here, though, don't just think about the costs of procuring the technology. Anytime you bring a new technology in, if you're going to use it effectively, you're going to have to train people on it. That's going to cost money. Some of it might have certain maintenance that needs to be done regularly. Or also, even if you're going to start collecting large amounts of data on students, making sure that the data is good quality. I've been reading recently about smart policing and how police are collecting more data and more information on people than ever before, on par with some of our national security agencies, the FBI, the NSA. And the book I was reading pointed something very interesting out, which was that those groups like the FBI, they have whole teams dedicated toward vetting the data for its quality. But the police, they will just take the data and run with it without checking it first. And it's the same kind of thing I ask myself with schools, where it's like, you're getting this data and you're just assuming that it's correct to begin with, without even thinking like, well, do we need to spend some time cleaning this up, making sure that everything is accurate? And that is another potential cost that should be factored in, even if you're getting information from a website that claims to be quote unquote free. A really good example, if you haven't heard of this, is the LA school iPad scandal, where LA, again, several years ago, was planning on being one of the first school districts to have a 1-to-1 iPad ratio for students. And this is just such an interesting thing to read. I recommend everyone go take a look at it. They overpaid for the devices. They didn't put any thought into the training aspects of it. Ultimately, the initiative was a complete failure. And it's interesting because, and this is again, go back to that image of trying to cut the grass with scissors. It doesn't have to be that way. I think lots of districts have successfully rolled out a 1-to-1 ratio like this. But it is only if they're taking into account all those other things regarding training, maintenance, the total cost of ownership, not just the initial cost of procurement. And I think another cost to consider is, once you're using the technology in the classroom, is it going to potentially waste people's time or cause other issues? I like this a lot from Jason Hong from Carnegie Mellon University regarding voice assistant technology. Saying, they're intended for home use. Teachers should consider the potential for misfires, such as Alexa accidentally being activated, or disruptions, like a kindergartner who keeps yelling out for Alexa to turn off the lights. And if that were to happen, what would you do? You'd just unplug the technology so that it wouldn't trigger that anymore. And then you're not even using the technology. So is it giving you any benefit? Was it worth investing in the first place? So again, what I think I'm getting at here is, there's a lot of things to consider in terms of overall costs, not just procurement costs, as well as the unintended side effects of the technology. Okay, parent input is something I highly recommend if you're going to start investing in anything new. In general, you should develop your technology policies with parent input. You don't want them to find out that you started social media monitoring by hearing from it offhanded from a teacher that, oh, we saw this tweet of your daughter's or something like that. That parent might be like, wait, you're looking at my kid's Twitter feed? Can you tell me a little bit more about this? So on that topic of social media monitoring, for those of you who are not familiar with it, so this was in the New York Times last year. So there is I don't remember the exact company. They're out of Vermont. Oh, Social Sentinel. It's there in my picture. So the way it works is they geofence. So that means they just look at all the Twitter or Facebook feeds or whatever in a particular geographic area, and then flag ones that appear threatening, and then share those with the LEA. So many concerns that come of this. Again, in the case in the New York Times article, they talked about they did not provide parents with any transparency. They didn't let parents know that they were doing this. No transparency basically means there's no accountability. And that I think is where the real concern is. If parents don't know you're doing it, then you could do it. You could be doing all sorts of things with it, maybe even out of the original scope. I think there becomes questions of the effectiveness as well that could be addressed with parents. Honestly, for social media monitoring to work, you are basically assuming that individuals are going to telegraph in advance what their behavior is going to be. And that assumption might not always be true. I think sometimes it is, but I think you're hoping for that kind of ideal situation where a student will post like at exactly 1:52 p.m. tomorrow, I will bring out a knife and I will attack this student and this student. In most cases, I don't think it's going to be that clear. And there's, of course, I think a liability that comes with this, that you're suddenly collecting information that schools have never really collected before. And if you have a false positive, there's a liability that comes with that. But there's also issues of false negatives, where if a student does attack someone, then if you didn't catch it, becomes the question of, well, shouldn't you have done something? You're paying for this. I think also it's worth noting with any kind of preventative technology, so let's think of a scenario where you're doing social media monitoring, you feel reasonably certain based on someone's tweet that there is going to be an incident at the school the next day. So you contact local police and they station a couple of police officers, extra police officers in and around the school. Nothing happens that day. So how do we interpret this? Did we successfully identify and deter an incident? Or was it a false positive and nothing was going to happen in the first place? You can't tell because you don't have that counterfactual. So this, again, I think makes it very hard to determine the effectiveness of some of these technologies. Okay, intended use. Going back to personal assistants, which have a number of issues, and we had, I think Susan Bearden talked about this a few months ago on one of these webinars. There are a number of potential legal issues that can come up with it, whether it impacts CIPA, whether it impacts FERPA. But what I think is very interesting was just Amazon's opinion. So Bill Fitzgerald was in a meeting with an Amazon rep and asked whether or not Alexa should be used in a classroom. And the rep's unequivocal answer was no. He said that Alexa and Dot are not intended for the classroom, and the response was unambiguous. And I believe the reasoning was that Amazon basically said, we are not building these to be compliant with CIPA, with FERPA. We are building these with homes intended. And I think that's really interesting, and it raises the question before you start putting this stuff in the classroom, was the people who are making it, did they ever anticipate that it was going to be used in the classroom? I'm not against novel uses of technology. I think it should be part of the calculation, though. If the company themselves say, we don't think this should be used in the classroom, it's worth having the discussion, I think, before actually using it. And then lastly, the effectiveness and the pedagogical value of the technology. So we already kind of talked about this idea of effectiveness with the social media monitoring. Another one that's coming up a lot is facial recognition technology. So last year in July, there was an article that talked about how more and more districts are purchasing surveillance facial recognition technology, despite the fact that it hasn't been shown yet how effective they are at actually stopping a threat. And in fact, a lot of research has shown that they aren't even necessarily very good at identifying minorities, so people of color in particular. And there end up being concerns with that as well. In terms of effectiveness of, it only can identify individuals that are in your database. So if there is someone that shouldn't be at the school, you won't know who they are. And if it is, for example, a student who should be at the school but is going to attack someone, it's not going to list them as a threat. So I'm not against this kind of technology. I just think it's worth bringing up all of these concerns before you implement it, because it gives you an opportunity to recognize the potential shortcomings and build policies around that to help mitigate. I think a big one that's worth talking about from a pedagogical value point of view, and this is a study I like referring to a lot, even though it's very old, from 1975. It was a study at Stanford where they looked at the effects of surveillance on children's motivation. And what they ultimately found was that if you were to surveil a student on an activity, it decreased their motivation to do that activity in the future. Now, I used to work as a foreign language teacher, and in teaching a language, motivation was very important to me. Learning a language is so cognitively challenging that you're probably not going to do it if you don't have the motivation. And it's something we don't really talk about with a lot of these technologies we're bringing into the school. Do they help motivate students? Or if we're just constantly collecting data, constantly surveilling students, is that going to have a negative impact on their motivation to learn? And again, I think this can be hard to say completely generalizably. All students are different. I think, going back to the personal assistance a second ago, even though I personally wouldn't find a ton of value in trying to learn from Alexa, some students, that might really ignite their passion for learning. Those are all things that should be taken into account. But I think that motivation, and whether it's having a positive effect on student motivation or not, is something that's worth thinking about. So to summarize, and hopefully leaving some time for questions, so I think it is important to remember to, above all, be reasonable when it comes to legal compliance. When starting any kind of data privacy, data security plan, I think it's very easy to have the initial tendency to go overboard. and then have to step things back a little bit. Consider potential misfires and unintended harms that might come from the technology. Consider all the costs, not just the initial procurement or setup costs. There's training costs, there's maintenance costs, there's quality costs. Are you willing to pay all of those to get the most out of the technology you're using? Involve parents early on in the discussion. Use the tools for their intended use, or at the very least consider their intended use as part of your calculation. And ultimately ask good questions about the effectiveness of the technology, particularly because with so much new stuff, there isn't a lot of information out there. So without having, lots of reports, based on 10 years of data of Alexa in the classroom to be able to say, yes, it's good, no, it's not. You have to be upfront about the assumptions you're making, what you're hoping, and have, possibly some little collection of qualitative data as you're using it to determine whether it's worth continuing its use. So that is the bulk of my presentation. I'll now pass it to Amelia, or however we're doing questions.
Hi, David. Thank you again so much for your presentation. Just so everyone is aware, you can put questions in the chat. I'm also actually going to unmute all of you for this, because I think some of the questions that you might may want to ask may not have clear-cut answers. So fielding getting input from the rest of the group might be useful. So the first